I came to the coast telling myself I was only here to make a catalog, to do a clean, sensible job, and then leave before the first proper storm. The museum in the Baltic town had hired me for a month to digitize its audio archive. Fishermen's interviews, lighthouse logs read aloud, radio traffic from the old ferry line. A manageable set of tasks, a short contract. Somewhere quiet to be the person I kept imagining I still was. The building itself sat back from the harbor behind a strip of wind-stunted birches, its boards gray with salt, its windows warped just enough to show you the sea twice when you looked once. Inside it smelled of waxed wood, wet rope, and that faint metallic tang you taste at the edge of fog. No one else kept my hours. I preferred the evenings, when the town's little bars hushed and you could hear the buoys knock against their chains and the gulls give up their arguing. The hiss of the tape decks felt like company. They gave me a key and a shoebox of labeled cassettes, some in brittle cases, some wrapped in paper slips, soft with handling. The catalog was a ledger with sensible grid lines and narrow columns for name, date, condition, notes. I opened the first tape, clicked it in, and the room took a breath I didn't know it had been holding. A man's voice, wavering with age, began to describe a storm in the winter of '79. He spoke slowly, as if weighing each word on his tongue to make sure it held. And even though the recording crackled, I could hear the room around him. A stove ticking, a spoon against enamel, the light creak of a chair. He said the storm sounded like iron being bent by a hand too patient to ever tire. He said the lighthouse watchers played chess without speaking for 3 days, and that at some point on the second night, they heard someone call from the water by the breakwater. A call so close and so ordinary that Stefan nearly threw the door open before he remembered the rules. Never answer a voice from the water when the fog is moving east. He said it was a rule the town kept without anyone writing it down. Each evening I worked through tapes, the museum's radiator clicking as it cooled, the winter daylight eroding by 4. I logged titles, I trimmed silence, I labeled files by date and speaker when the labels held and guessed when they did not. The old recorder on my desk had a red light that looked like an eye in the early gloom. When I pressed stop, it went blind, and I would have to sit for a moment caught between noises. Outside, the sea rearranged itself, and I could feel the building understand, boards tightening and loosening with the air. I made tea. I wore a sweater that held the smell of the room. I was, in those first days, as intact as I knew how to be. On the 7th tape, I found the first thing that felt like it was meant for me. The label said, River Mouth, Notes, but when I played it, a voice I could not place said, in English accented by the coast, "If you are listening alone, do not listen all the way." It was a soft voice, close to the microphone. "If there is fog against the window, wait." I paused the tape and looked at the window. The glass showed me a wavering version of the harbor lights, and beyond them a smear that might have been fog, or the way the pane was wavy with age. I told myself this was local color, a flair for drama from an old curator who wanted to make the archive feel alive. I pressed play. The voice began to recite coordinates that meant nothing to me, and then switched without comment into describing the smell of the mud exposed at low tide. "It smells like coins and sweet rot," the voice said. "And when you stand where the river loosens into the sea, you can hear 2 kinds of water arguing about who will hold what." I wrote the words in my ledger because they felt exactly true. I went home by the same path each night, past the empty fish market, over the boards of the little bridge that clacked under my feet in a rhythm my body began to memorize. The town was gentle in its way, lights low to keep the stars, windows close to keep the heat. And when I passed the alley by the baker's some nights, I thought I could hear someone practicing a song with a tape-recorded accompaniment. A melody I almost remembered, and then lost when I tried to hum it. I slept well the first week, and then I did not. Something began knocking in my dreamed rooms. A careful knocking like a neighbor who knows you're there and doesn't want to scold you for not answering. The 9th tape was misfiled. The hand on the paper sleeve was not the same hand as the others. The date was smudged. When I pressed play, I heard wind booming in a way that was not on the other tapes, too intimate and unbroken, as if the microphone had been left in the mouth of a bottle. Then my own name, not my full name, but the one I rarely used, the one my grandmother had given me before we argued about everything that mattered. I thought I had misheard. The wind attenuated. It came again. My name, spoken without urgency, spoken from a room I knew only when I was not looking at it. I stopped the tape and rewound it a little. I do not know what I expected to hear the second time, except an ordinary mistake. This time I heard a different detail. The way the voice softened on the last consonant, as if it felt relief in saying it. As if saying my name released something that had been caught behind it. I told myself this was coincidence, and that a town where half the men were named after saints and half the women after plants could easily produce a voice reading a name that sounded like mine. I told myself the tape hiss had drawn the shapes of a familiar sound, and my mind had colored them in. I logged it as weather, unmarked, and worked through 2 calmer reels where a teacher told a class the names of cloud types and a little boy corrected her on the local word for a fog that brings eels onto the road. The museum's radiator sighed. The window pane thrummed faintly, a cat's purr of pressure. When I turned to put the labeled cases back where they belonged, a scrap of paper slid from between them and caught against my sleeve. I smoothed it. The handwriting was my grandmother's. June ledger, finished before the 14th, it said. A note written in the narrow slanted script I had taught myself to imitate in school, to sign excuse slips. The paper smelled faintly of tea. I knew then, with the suddenness of small truths that are not small, that I had been here before, or had been expected, or had been folded into some list someone kept to make sense of the winter. My goal became, though I did not tell the director when she asked how I was getting on, to find the tape that explained why the archive knew my name. I made my work narrower and deeper. I stopped walking by the harbor and instead went straight from my rented room to the museum, the key in my glove, my breath drawing little spirals in the air that unfurled and vanished. I arrived earlier and left later. The town made room for me the way a drawer makes room for a familiar knife. You don't think about the shape until you put your hand in and it is not where you left it. The fog came in long and low one evening. Not theatrical, not full of drama, just a diligent, close-knit drift. It pressed its cool against the windows, and I could feel the pressure of it in my teeth. The tapes that night were all interviews with lighthouse keepers, men who spoke as if words were nails they were driving into a deck plank, steady and necessary. They talked about rules. Never count the steps aloud. Never turn to look back when someone calls you from the stairs after midnight. Never keep a calendar that omits the names the sea uses. I did not know what that last one meant, but the phrase stuck behind my ribs like a small piece of wood. When I packed for the night, I noticed the recorder light was still on. I had not pressed stop. The tape inside had a plain white label, no writing. I had no memory of putting it in. It clicked as it rewound itself without my hand on it. The fog dimpled the window with condensation. I told myself I would play 30 seconds and then go. The voice was my own, not like my own, not a resemblance. Mine, recorded in a room that held the same air I was breathing. If you are listening alone, my voice said, softer than I use with people. A voice I kept for lamps and sleeping animals. And the second before I changed my mind, wait for the clock by the stairwell to stop, then answer when I ask your name. I waited without meaning to. The clock, which ticked perpetually, did not. The ticking swallowed itself between 1 second and the next. The room fell into a hush so total, I could hear the minute sounds of the building resting together. Rope tensioning, wood setting against a nail, the tiniest patter of something changing its mind about where to sit in the roof. "Your name," the recording asked. I had a choice. I could turn the machine off. I could take the tape out and put it back in its case and leave the museum without locking up and walk to the edge of the harbor and let the fog stiffen my hair and not come back in the morning. My hand moved toward the stop button. I heard the faintest brush, like cloth against a doorframe, and the smell of the room shifted. Less wax and paper, more wet iron. "Shaw." "Say it," the voice coaxed. I said my name. There was no dramatic crack, no heavy footstep, no sudden cold. Instead, the ordinary sounds returned one by one, as if they had been waiting in the corridor for permission to come in. The clock ticked. The buoy bells outside remembered their work. The fog breathed against the glass. The tape continued. "Good," my voice said. "You can take the shoebox now." I looked. There was a shoebox on the chair I hadn't noticed in the corner. It was the color of salt-stained cardboard and tied with string the soft gray of old rope. I untied it because not to would have required inventing a different version of myself in an instant, and I no longer knew if I had that kind of energy. Inside were photographs. The museum in longer summers. A boy holding a carp longer than his arm. The ferry in a winter so bright it hurt to look at the snow. The lighthouse painted in a color the town no longer used. Under the photographs was a ledger, the twin to mine. Entries in the same hand as my grandmother's, with notes written in a second hand that curled more and made decisions later in each word. My hand. I knew the way the loop on the G hooked itself closed. The ledger was dated 4 Junes ago. I had not been here then. The recording gave instructions without insisting. "You'll need the map behind the radio," it said, and I found a folded chart tucked as the voice promised. The chart's paper held the sweet, stale smell that belongs specifically to maps. On it, someone had marked a route not by lines, but by times. Notations like, "Walk when you can hear the bell at the point, but not the bell at the nearer buoy," and "Turn when the smell changes from salt to iron." I followed the instructions because they fit in my body when I read them. They made the kind of sense that does not ask your permission, only your attendance. When I stood up, the room seemed closer than it had been. Not smaller, but closer in the way a person is when they have said your name inside your throat. I put on my coat and turned the key in the lock and walked into the fog. I passed the fish market. I did not see the stalls, but I smelled yesterday's sea and something like parsley. I walked over the little bridge, and the boards made a sound like a children's game. The bell at the point was a deeper voice than the nearer buoy, and for a stretch I could hear them both, and then only the far one. And that was when the chart said to slow down and listen for steps that were not mine. I stopped. I heard steps a beat behind me, light, unembarrassed. I did not turn. The map said not to. The steps came closer and then side by side with mine, and I could feel the press of someone looking where I looked. "Almost," said a voice that could have been mine after a long illness. We walked along a row of houses that kept their curtains closed even in fog, because curtains have their own lives and need to be let alone. The smell changed. The air stopped tasting like salt, and instead tasted like a coin must taste after spending a winter under ice. "Now," the voice said, and I turned. The lighthouse across the harbor was visible only as a paleness more stubborn than the fog. But close to me, almost on the line where the harbor gives itself to the river, there was a wooden hut I had not noticed from the museum windows. It had a rusted weather vane, and it creaked in a rhythm you could have set a clock by if the clock was tired. Inside, a tape recorder waited on a stool, and the stool waited on boards that had been oiled so faithfully they shone like a late afternoon. The recorder was the same model as the one at the museum. Its red light was on. The voice beside me stopped pretending it walked on feet. It hummed in a way that made the walls remember their nails. I recognized the place from a photograph I had not yet looked at. I recognized the feeling that I was an hour late for something that had not happened. I recognized the ledger. On a shelf rested a copy of the ledger I had found in the shoebox. My hand touched the cover and knew exactly how it weighed. I pressed record. I said my name. I said it in the same tone the first voice had used on the striking of consonants, as if the saying relieved pressure. I told the listener, myself, some future me, someone who fit into the empty space shaped like me, that if you are listening alone, you should not listen all the way. Not until the clock stops. Not unless you are prepared to say your name and mean the version of you who answered. I described the smell of mud when the river loosens into the sea. I said the rules the keepers kept and the ones they never wrote. I marked times on the map not with lines, but with instructions a body can obey without thinking about what it believes. While I spoke, the fog leaned against the hut like a dog allowed almost to come in. I did not think about how I had gotten here the first time, or which time this was. My voice did not tremble. I felt something in me take a step I had been avoiding. When the tape ended, there was no applause, no discovery, only the quiet pride of a task finished in the way it had been meant. I put the recorder back where it waited, and the stool creaked, and the hut breathed. The steps behind me did not follow when I left. The bells remembered themselves in pairs, and then one by one. I walked the map backwards. The museum key was colder when I let it into the lock, and the room smelled newly of wet wool, as if I had been gone long enough for another season to have passed. On my desk, the shoebox lay open to the photograph of the boy with the carp. Behind it, tucked under the radio, the chart waited with my notations, and my ledger lay open to where I had written, "River mouth, voice notes, do not file with weather." I added a line. June ledger finished. The date was the 14th. I slept in the museum that night because the idea of my rented room felt like an obligation I no longer owed. The radiator ticked. The glass sighed. Somewhere in the timber, a sound like the clicking of dominoes ran along the grain. In the early morning, when the fog unzipped itself from the town and folded away into the field beyond the harbor, I woke to the softest knocking, polite, as if a neighbor who knows your habits had brought a plate back. It came from inside the wall behind the shelves. I did not answer at first. I listened to my heart remind me what it was for. I thought of the rules. Do not answer a voice from the water when the fog moves east. The fog had moved west in leaving. The rule did not apply. I touched the wall with my palm. It was cool in the way stone is cool before it learns your temperature. I said my name through the boards. From the other side, my voice, older by a thread, nearer to the grain of the wood than to air, said it back to me. I didn't feel fear so much as the feeling of finding a tool that fit exactly the screw you had been wearing down with the wrong one. This has always been the logical mechanism. The town keeps itself by keeping us, and we keep the town by keeping what we record. Not a trap, a rhythm, a calendar without numbers. The kind that marks itself by heat and sound, and the way paper behaves under a certain humidity. I understood that my goal was never simply to digitize the archive so it could be packaged into neat files and sent to someone's radio series. My goal was to complete the path that brought the voice to me and then set it down for the next set of hands. In the days after, the work went more quickly. I found what needed to be found. The misfiled tapes were not misfiled. The names came where they belonged and did not ring oddly when spoken aloud. I walked home sometimes to prove I could, and the bridge made the same clack, and the baker's alley held the same humming. But when the fog came softly one afternoon, while I was fixing a tape with a pencil stub and patience, I understood with the quiet weight of a decision that there was no going back to the person I'd been on the train north. That person believed you could keep certain drawers in your life empty and others full and not have to rethink the furniture. I knew now that the drawers in this town rearranged themselves with the weather, and that my name belonged on a page in a hand that looked like mine, even if it had been written when I thought I was elsewhere. It was not an erasure. It was an addition pressed thin enough to read through other layers. I felt, for the first time in years, a peace that had nothing to do with escape. I will finish the catalog before the 14th, as I did and as I will. When the director asks, I will tell her the work went cleanly, that the tapes held up well, that the only surprise was finding more of the lighthouse logs than we had expected. I will hand her the files and the ledger and keep for myself the copy of the map with instructions a body can keep without writing them down. On nights when the bells speak to one another, I will sit by the window and listen for the polite knock in the walls, not to be called out into danger, but to be reminded that the shape of me fits into the shape of this place, that what we record records us. And when a voice with my patience comes through a tape player far from here and says the first small caution, I hope the person listening will wait, and then answer when asked their name, and then choose, as I did, the version of themselves that knows how to hold a place without owning it. I will not explain this to anyone who does not already feel the air change when the fog arrives. I will not explain it to myself more than I need to. The ledger is finished. The red light goes on. The sea breathes. The boards remember. And in the quiet that follows, if I listen carefully, I can hear two kinds of water agreeing at last on who will hold what.